Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Trish Lavery. I'm from the OECD's Strategic Foresight Unit, and I'm thrilled to be moderating a panel today looking at how society is going to interact with the digital world in the future. I have an amazing lineup for you. So I'd like to welcome, first off, Jim Maltby to the stage. Jim is Principal Scientist of Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in the UK, and he brings a multidisciplinary approach to his work. He uses design approaches to bring the future to life, and this is demonstrated on his current work with the Dstl VR Museum of the Future. Jim, welcome to the stage. Second up, we have Toshi Hoo. Toshi's Research Director and Strategist at the Institute for the Future. He's a pioneer in both emerging and developing technologies. He's also an award-winning filmmaker, so if you haven't seen his feature-length documentary, The Singularity is Near, I highly recommend that on your flight on the way home. Welcome to the stage, Toshi. Third up, we've got Danilov. She's the head of the Foresight Centre at the Estonian Parliament, and she's been with the Foresight Centre since its inception in 2016. She really brings a balanced approach to foresight, balancing that open-ended, blue sky thinking with a really practical, down-to-earth aspect, connecting this broad thinking with the actions of today. Join me, please, in welcoming Taya. And last but certainly not least, we have Jerome Glenn. He's Executive Director and CIO of the Millennium Project, which is a global foresight network and a think tank established in 1996 that's now grown to over 71 nodes around the world. The purpose of the Millennium Project is to improve humanity's prospects for a better world and a better future. Please join me in welcoming Jerome. Thank you, Jerome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Toshi, you've done a lot of research in the past about the intersection between technologies and society. Can you tell me a little bit, what do you think Web 3.0 will mean for society?
Sure. Well, just to start off by saying, as you introduced me, I work at the Institute for the Future, and we're one of the longest running futures organizations in the world. Started back in 1968, and by some of the folks working on the early ARPANET, or what was the predecessor to the internet. And some of the folks who started Institute for the Future asked themselves, like, what would happen if this distributed communication system was used by people who weren't in the military or academic world? What if everybody in the world had access to this kind of data and information? Now, at the time, it was kind of an absurd idea back in 1968. Wasn't even the internet at that time. And well, basically for the last 50 plus years, the Institute's been asking that same question through a variety of different lenses. Like, what does it mean to have these massively global distributed communication networks? And at the Institute, we have a number of labs, everything from the future of food, future of government, future of work, equitable futures. My lab's the Emerging Media Lab, and we're looking at the future of human communication, connection, and collaboration through the lens of emerging media technologies. And when we use the term media, we use that quite broadly to talk about any tool, platform, and technology that allows human beings to communicate, collaborate, and connect. So, of course, the idea that the whole world might use this internet has now pretty much come true, and it's obviously radically transformed the world. When we refer to kind of the first Web 1, that was a period when it was just becoming accessible to most regular people. And then what was affectionately dubbed Web 2.0 was kind of evolution of this, where we shifted from just putting information online to adding richer media, developing the ability for user-generated content. Suddenly now everybody could contribute movies, videos, television, images, writing, all these kinds of things. So now we've gone from thinking the idea that we'll have a distributed communication network across the globe from being kind of a preposterous idea to being, and obviously it was inevitable in the end. And so everyone's asking the question, what is the next internet, of course? And when I say everyone, there's some specific people that are really interested, those who would like to own and control that next internet, because they understand that this is not only a technology, but represents a great deal of power to control and own much of human society, human commerce, human interaction, human politics, human perception of the world. So when you ask what is going to be Web 3.0, I think it's a little bit of a challenging question, obviously. We believe that no one can predict the future. Don't believe anybody that says they can predict the future, especially if they're from Silicon Valley, and I happen to be from Silicon Valley. And so there's been a lot of folks right now who are trying to sell Web 3 or Web 3.0, and that has been kind of very specific. There's been some very specific marketing efforts to make some claims about what specifically will be this inevitable next version of the internet. And for some, they believe that it's going to be based on a distributed and decentralized system. Many of the folks who subscribe to kind of the point of view of the Web 3 specifically believe that it's going to be based around things like cryptocurrency and blockchain-based experiences. Then there's the folks who believe that it's going, that Web 3 is really going to be the metaverse or virtual reality, and that it's going to be immersive. And I think, and then there's another group of folks who would say that the next web is not going to be the decentralized web, it's not going to be the immersive web, but it's going to be the computational web, meaning based on artificial intelligence. So I think it's impossible, as I said, to predict exactly what's going to happen. I think within the mindset around the idea of cryptocurrency or decentralization, decentralization has become quite a buzzword at this point. And it's really vague. It's really more of a marketing term at this point, just as Web3 is a marketing term, just as the information superhighway at one moment was a marketing term. And it's helpful for us to help try to imagine these things. But with the view of the need for decentralized technologies, I think in my perspective, and the Institute for the Future has been looking at blockchain for many, many years. It's not a new technology. It's not a magic technology, although many people might try to present it as such. But I think the crypto and Web3 community has done a great service in the sense of they've identified a lot of the real problems that we're facing with the web. The centralization of power, the centralization of ownership. Now, I feel it's quite questionable whether they're presenting actual solutions. A lot of the solutions that you see start as decentralized, but somehow re-centralized. And we also have a lot of challenges whether or not we're talking about decentralization of the technology itself, or are we talking about decentralization of governance? These things get kind of merged together when you use just the term decentralized. So I think that's a little bit of maybe a over-marketed future. And I think in the last year we've seen that kind of hype cycle, and it's kind of collapsed under its own weight at this point. A lot of my work has been focused around virtual reality. I started at the Institute in 2016 with the emergence of consumer virtual reality. So we've done a lot of research and prototyping with this. We've been very specifically interested in social VR, the idea that virtual reality will be something where we'll be meeting with each other using the internet. It's actually interesting. Today is the anniversary of Mark Zuckerberg, the 1-year anniversary of Mark Zuckerberg announcing his pivot to the metaverse. And if you've been following the news, people were quite excited about this at first. But then today, 1 year in the future from that first announcement, I think we're starting to see people ask questions, even internally at Facebook, or at Meta, sorry. Their own employees are having trouble using their own metaverse. So I think we're going to start to see, actually maybe even today, because later today he's going to be announcing his new initiatives at Oculus Connect, a little bit more skepticism. And the last thing I'll say is just, I think that for me, the real emergent kind of force that we're already seeing dramatic impacts on is the introduction of this new kind of class of artificial intelligence, generative AI. The ability to take text to image, so put in prompts and use large language models to either have it extrapolate concepts that are surprisingly compelling, as well as images that are surprisingly compelling. So we can go back more to that later, but that's kind of my overview.
Absolutely, fantastic, thank you, and we'll definitely come back to that a little later. Taya, can I jump to you now? Given the sort of the questions around the locus of control and the ambiguity in some ways of this marketing term, as Toshi pointed out, of Web 3.0, what do you think the risks and possible risks and rewards for individuals in this future?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and glad to be here. And thank you, Toshi, so much for this comprehensive overview, so I don't need to explain much myself anymore. So coming to the idea of the decentralized internet, the new internet. So I mean, the basic idea behind this, it is that the individual can regain control over his or her data. And in the current web, the Web 2, we have become the products. So our data is gathered and used for targeted advertising. So, and this has brought along the situation where the playground is not fair or even anymore, so that the big tech has much more data, much more opportunities than the smaller companies or not to say the individuals who have no understanding of who is using his or her data for what purpose. So gaining back control is the big reward, the biggest kind of idea behind this decentralized Web 3. However, of course, how successful will it be? Okay, first I would like to do the remark that surprisingly, this decentralized Web 3 and European Commission are working at the same direction. They both want to give back control to the individual over his or her data. So this is kind of surprising perhaps, but of course the means and the visions are very different how to achieve it. In case of this decentralized Web 3, it's relying on the opportunities of the new technology, the blockchain and tokenization and smart contracts. And what I like about it is that there's no, or it should at least be in the way that there's no big player with big agenda to push, but rather as many small projects emerging here and there and kind of becoming a torrent, converging into the same direction. That's a great vision. However, the interoperability of different platforms and projects remains a question, at least so far, but of course we are only at the very beginning. But my data is not only in, I don't know, in this NFT platform where I do participate, but my data is in the health registry, it is my grocery store, shopping history, it is at my car repair shop, my car maintenance data, and the big question yet is how to make use cases for the decentralization and for the tokenization in all of these fields, and even more how to not that me as an individual that I need to be active in I don't know, in tens of platforms, in tens of applications, but rather I would like to connect to this, to have a look at all of my data and have the opportunity to decide upon what do I do with this data at the one single shop. So this single shop concept is very important. Will it emerge based on market forces, or does it need to be helped to get into life with some smart regulation? This is an open question for me so far. So I stop here just to leave some time for the others too.
Fantastic, thank you so much. It's such a great point. I've spent 10 years working at nudging, for better behavior, nudging our citizens. I want access to my data to nudge myself rather than other people doing it for my own purposes. And Jim, I know this is an area sort of after, close to your heart about, how could we use this digital environment to sort of better understand and better navigate through the real world? So can you tell us a little bit about your work in that area?
Yeah. So a lot of my work or the way I think about futures and foresight is a lot of futures is really about narrative and storytelling, but also about listening to other people's stories. I mean, quite critical. So as Toshi said, the metaverse and Silicon Valley's projection of what Web 3.0 is, we as futurists or foresight practitioners is kind of to be more critical about that. And I've been using some of our virtual reality technology to help build capacity and develop the abilities for our people to be more critical and think about stories in a more critical way. So just to explain how we've done that, so you mentioned the Virtual Reality Museum of the Future. So we've built a Virtual Reality Museum of the Future inspired by Noah's original Museum of the Future, and it's great to be in this place and talk about that. And it was great to go around the museum yesterday. It's amazing. But one of the elements we've done in our museum is, so in the presentation earlier, they were talking about one of the big issues we have is people don't pay attention to the things that are important in the long term. And the useful thing about VR is essentially it provides an experimental environment in which you can focus people's attention on specific things, because you put them in front of people's faces and you control what people see and how they... So we're looking at whether we can put stories and things in front of people and some of our decision makers and users that need to make decisions about the long term in a way that that means that they start to think more critically about stories and develop that proficiency. So can we put strange worlds in front of them so that then they become more happy with strange worlds and more diverse scenarios and change that over the time? Can we measure that, and can we use virtual and digital environments to allow us to get some understanding of how people think about that and how we can change their behaviours and improve their ability to think about the long term? So that's really the key thing, and the key bit that I'm really interested in and around this Web 3.0 really is that it's in some ways a first world problem, because if you live in a place that's not digitized, you don't have this problem with all your data. And does that give them an advantage over people in the developed world? It's quite interesting. So, but the key thing is there's a lady in the UK called Rachel Caldecott, and she talks about just enough internet. What's just enough internet? And I think that's a really useful concept. What's just enough digitization? What's just enough Web 3.0? What's just enough of this stuff that it gives us useful things, but we don't burn the planet and destroy things in the process and use up all the resources, which we tend to want to do. So we've developed cars and transport systems so it can do everything, but at the detriment of everything else. So what's just enough in digitization? Because actually we're analog beings, we're not digital beings. Actually, what's the best and the sweet spot between those two things?
Beautiful, Jim, thank you so much. Exactly, that's the question of the day. What is just enough and who gets to decide? And Jerome, that's a lovely segue to some of the work that you've been doing on global governance in this area. So can you tell us about that and your thoughts for what's needed in terms of global governance?
Yes, at the Millennium Project, we're about to do, I hope, a major study on anticipatory governance. And the focus on that would be the transition from artificial narrow intelligence like we have today to artificial general intelligence, which we don't really have yet. In our judgment, if the initial conditions for artificial general intelligence are not done well, then how superintelligence evolves from general intelligence could very well be like science fiction horror shows. So the problem with doing this is people will say, well, general intelligence is so far down the road. What do we got to worry about it now for? And I say, well, because to get an agreement on the initial conditions will take years. Because the agreement is not just today or Dubai. The agreement has to be global. The Chinese have to agree, the Americans have to agree, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also have to have those definitions precise. I work on the IEEE's AI governance panel. We're doing just narrow intelligence, not general. And the detail that you have to get into is excruciating because that detail has to be auditable. And it will take us years to get agreements, to have a UN treaty ratified, or maybe not just UN, but it may be corporations, because in the future the rate's going so fast you can't just rely on governments on these things. And then to put in a government system and an implementation system will take a long time. So if somebody says, well, it's 20 years in the future, we don't even have a governance system for climate change, all right? So it takes a long time to make serious agreements. And this has to be a global agreement, because if Egypt does everything perfectly and another country next to it doesn't, we're still in trouble. Because if we, and I'll repeat this is a very serious. I would like you all to think about this. What should be the initial conditions for this general intelligence? And how do we monitor it? How do we audit it? How do we make an agreement about it? To me, this is one of the greatest challenges humanity faces today, to get that right. Because if we don't get it right, your science fiction horror stories may come true.
Very good, a very good warning sign there. And Taya, I know that you've been thinking about this more at a sort of a country level. So what do you see as sort of the future of e-governance?
Yeah, I was afraid that you are asking that. Do we have a vision of how to tackle the general intelligence, generalized artificial intelligence? So no, so far we are not yet. But coming to the, the future of e-governance, we actually, in the Estonian Foresight Centre, we built a few scenarios about it 4 years ago. And one of them was called networked governance. And it was actually strikingly similar to the ideas of Web3, basically, if I now come to think of this. So the network governance presumed that all the decisions will be made at the closest level to the citizen, and that the citizens can co-create the public service. There are no set standards for each and every service, but whatever community or region wants a public service, be it then childcare, road maintenance, whatever, so they take the initiative. Of course, the government is there to support them. Anyway, they take the initiative, they find the funds, they take care of the operation. So in this Web3 discussion, there is this concept of DAOs, distributed, decentralized autonomous organizations. And it's basically the same idea, or a similar idea at least, that people who want to solve something or to provide a service, so they come together and they are mediated via this decentralized technology in a way that whatever resource or energy is put into this action by anyone, it gets tokenized. It gets tokens in advance as a reward, and then these tokens can be monetized, even sold in the secondary market, etc. So that the energy and resources that you commit into joint action, you can actually monetize afterwards. So that is basic idea of the DAOs based on the Web3 concept, and our network governance came to the same conclusion that we should, this could be the new model of governance for a country. But there, of course, are some risks. If this idea was discussed in public, people, most of them, they became afraid that how come there are no set standards for public service anymore? So we didn't like to be worse off than our neighbors, for example, worse off than the other region, the other community, even if we recognize that we haven't put as much energy into it as the others. So this, the lack of set standards is one of the things that people try to, well, are kind of tend to resist. And the other question, who supervises different risks and threats? For example, if providing this service entails, if done incompetently, perhaps there might be risks for health, risks for lives even. So who is the supervisory power to take care that everything goes smoothly? And well, if you just say to people, you have to take the responsibility yourself, you set the standards, you supervise, so they are not ready. Mostly they are not ready.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think bringing people along on this journey, you know, you can't underestimate the importance of that, you know, our decision makers and also society and our citizens. And, you know, I like to remind myself that sometimes people act in really surprising and seemingly illogical ways, you know. My favorite cognitive bias that humans fall prey to is the rhyme is reason effect. We're more likely to believe something if it rhymes than if it doesn't. You know, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, is the classic example. And it strikes me that the language we use and the stories and metaphors that we use to explain some of these new technological developments will you know, evolve the way that we interact with them and our beliefs as a society about these technologies. And Toshi, I know with your filmmaking and your other work, this is something you've been really looking into in sort of the emerging mythologies, I think is how you described it, about how we might sort of interact with these technologies. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Well, in our lab at Institute for the Future, we're looking very deeply at the technology that's emerging. But I think equally, if not more important, are the mythologies that are emerging. And these are the stories that we're telling ourselves and the way we're modeling the world. I think Jim would back me up on this. When you first start to research how to create a compelling virtual reality, you have to look at how do we perceive real reality, right? And the first thing you learn, or one of the first things you learn, is that this idea that reality is happening, we take it in, we think about it, and we act upon it, is actually wrong. What we really do is we take in tremendous amounts of information, we throw almost all of it away, and then we project out previous models, something that rhymes, right? Something that feels like, okay, we're pattern matching, okay. I believe I'm in this room and it's a auditorium and my brain is mostly projecting out. If you actually hold out your thumb and look like this, your thumbnail is as much sharp vision as your eyes have. Your eyes are darting around this room right now and filling in all the rest of this room with your projected idea of what this room is. And you know, this is not just science fiction, this is neuroscience here. And so what's important to understand is that we're mostly projecting out reality. And the realities that we're projecting out are the previous models, or another word for that would be stories, and another word for that would be mythology. And mythology and myths are a very special type of story, and they're important because they guide how we understand, well, as Joseph Campbell would say, 4 things: our relationship to ourselves as an independent consciousness, our relationship to each other, our relationship to our environment or our world, and then lastly, our relationship to mystery, to the unknown and the unknowable. And so we as a species have created language and story to help us make sense of not just what has happened, what is happening, but what might happen. The other thing that neuroscience tells us is that our brains are terrible at projecting models into the future. We mostly think about what's happened in the past, and we project that out also into the future. It can be useful, but also can create huge blind sides. That's why we're all creating this practice of figuring out how we can think about the future in better ways. And so one of the interesting shifts that we've been observing in our lab in terms of the cultural the archetypes of cultural mythology is this shift. In modern day, our mythologies are mostly presented to us within pop culture media and movies and television. Turns out one of the dominant kind of types of mythology right now is the superhero story. And we're seeing some really interesting shifts in the superhero story. And superhero stories were, heroes' journeys, essentially, to provide those 4 functions of myth, as Joseph Campbell outlined it. And in the 20th century, we had Superman, the man of steel, able to, faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap over a tall building. We've got the tallest building in the world here. These stories were all helping people to grapple with emerging technologies of the time, the increasing mobilization and mechanization of society in the 20th century. Then we saw kind of the emergence of things like, the X-Men and stories about mutants, or Godzilla even, which is anxiety about radioactivity and genetic engineering. We're at the cusp of a new type of mythology emerging. You might, if you've seen any superhero movies recently, you notice this term, not the metaverse, but the multiverse. And we're studying this terminology as a reflection of the type of story that humanity needs right now to grapple with, as Joseph Campbell might say, at this point in the hero's journey that society and humanity is on, we're at this, what he would call the step of refusal of the call. This is before the hero goes on the journey from their safe world into the special world. And the refusal of the call for humanity right now is pluralism. We're moving from a hero's journey to a collective journey in terms of our understanding that the problems that we need to solve, like climate change, they cannot be solved by individuals. They need to be solved collectively. They also can't be solved by things like the traditional kind of narrative arc that you look at something like Superman, where it's the story of good versus evil. The good character will destroy, contain, and defeat the evil character. You can't fight climate change. The new narratives, if you look at these films, the new narratives is about the collective journey, and they're about seeing a new narrative story arc and a new type of problem space, which is one that requires not defeating or containing or banishing, but integration, to understand things in more complexity, with more as a systems problem. And it requires a plurality of solutions, plurality of participation from people. And it just so happens that we're also, and this is the tie back to the internet, we have these communication technologies that could help us kind of on this collective journey. And we're developing these new technologies, specifically artificial intelligence, that are providing new ways to see complexity. I really love, we're not at general artificial intelligence yet, but I love Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer, has been talking a lot as a lot of this new generative AI is coming out. AI doesn't understand, it understands, okay, which is not the same as what human understanding, but it provides incredibly powerful and important new perspectives and allows us to take kind of the culmination and create new models. When we talk about something like GPT-3, that's a model of language by taking all these examples and all these this training data and seeing relationships in ways that human brains cannot. So I think when we look at the mythology right now of the multiverse, and it's interesting, as you mentioned, I directed a film with Ray Kurzweil called The Singularity is Near. And so I just presented a talk at the Primer Speculative Futures Conference entitled From the Singularity to the Multiverse, Shifting Media Mythologies. And if we see mythologies not just as stories we tell to entertain ourselves, but as stories for survival, then I think it's important to start to pay attention. And I think creative minds are in the media industries are intentionally putting forth these stories. It's a feedback loop, providing us with the kind of new models that we need, not just to understand the technology, but understand how this impacts ourselves and, and society at large. The Madness of the Multiverse is a new movie that came out. This is preparing us for the idea of what do you do when you can simulate or imagine anything? How does the human mind survive that? So this is why we look at mythologies.
Great. Toshi, thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank you.
We often think of ourselves as humans as walking around and analysing all the information and making the best decisions, but actually we're often walking around, our behaviour is driven by environmental factors, and our brains are working really fast to make a really cohesive narrative to explain to us what's going on. So, and Jim, I know this is something, you've done a bit of work in this space about the psychology, and you mentioned using, VR to really control the salience and draw people's attention in a virtual setting in a way that you couldn't before. Can you talk a little bit about what could be the future uses for that? What are some of the applications that we could use, and how could we use VR to better understand human psychology? I worry about the fact that, in an increasingly digital world, there's going to be records of all our behaviour, and sometimes as humans we need to reinvent ourselves in order to grow. Whereas in an increasingly sophisticated digital world, there's going to be a lot of data on what we said last year or 10 years ago that could trip us up. So what are your thoughts?
So one of the things that I think is a problem, but kind of links to some of the things that people have said already, is that the dominant kind of narrative is that humans don't think very well, and actually computers are better than humans at doing this. So I don't believe that general artificial intelligence is anywhere near or anything useful. And I won't debate that, but actually I think it's a really useful speculation. So if we're wanting to improve the way that global governance works, actually if people pay attention to that and they want to look at it, actually it's a useful thing to enable us to solve some of those problems. But I think this idea that we can that the way we think is problematic and full of biases is very much a problem, and we educate our people generally, I think, to think in that way, that, and all of our organisations, our systems are designed to reduce errors and control things, whereas actually Gary Klein talks about the fact that deviates from all the creative stuff and the insights and things. We miss all of those because we're too focused on reducing errors, and our organisations force us to think in this way. And there's some studies about kids and things about actually they become less creative the older they get because of the education systems reducing that. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in stories is that actually they help us convey lots of complex information really effectively and in much shorter kind of and more condensed ways. If we do it in our kind of what we would call evidence-based and lay out all the information, it's really hard to explain your thought process in those ways. So the super forecasting work about making forecasts improves people's ability to do that. That makes them better forecasters. Can we improve people's foresight by allowing them to understand how they reason and think more effectively around stories and around the narratives and the arguments that they construct? And so with the virtual reality stuff, we're trying to help generate that plurality, help people understand how they break their kind of knowledge shields, which is a psychological term about how they, they protect their models of understanding, and actually do this thing called unlearning and develop that ability to unlearn and be more open and curious about the world and question their own thinking. So futures is generally about being critical thinking and critically thinking about the world and the possibilities in the future. And really that's what we're trying to do with some of the stuff we're doing in the VR.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a hard road, isn't it? I often say no one ever gets fired for doing exactly the same thing that we did last year. You know, it's when you take a chance and you try and do something innovative. You know, that you're putting yourself at risk. Fantastic, Jim. Thanks very much. Jerome, we've got 5 minutes left. I wanted to come back to some work that you're doing, because we're seeing in our work at the OECD that misinformation and disinformation is one of the sort of major challenges of our times. And I know that you've been doing some work around thinking around this and you've said, you know, is it possible that we're going into a post-information age? Can you tell us what you mean by that and your thinking there?
Well, we've got two massive technology trends throughout time coming up to now. One is we're offloading our mind, consciousness, experience into the physical environment. So if I go to the hotel room and I take my shirt off, my shirt says, hey, don't do that, hang me up. And at the same time, we're micro-miniaturizing technology in and on our body. So those two massive trends will eventually merge, so the distinctions between human consciousness and technology will become irrelevant. In the same sense that when I call you on a telephone, I am not really talking to you directly. I'm talking to a machine that talks to a machine to talk, you know, etc. But we just get over that and we say, I'm talking to you, right? So imagine that on a larger scale with civilization. Now the nice thing about this is, back to the myth stuff, what kind of myth would help the world? You've got two orientations to a large degree throughout history. One is people say, well, we'll solve the problem by making a tool, the technocrat, etc. The other says, no, we'll do education, we'll share consciousness, you know, or the mystic side. So the mystic and the technocrat, we're going to have a conversation whether they like it or not, because as we design all this new technology, what's it got to do with mind consciousness, right? Well, who are the masters of that throughout history, right? So I think that we'll have a conscious technology age, might be the next one, and be facilitated by a metaphor, if I can. You have the narrow intelligence running our body. You know, we have the intelligence that does the digestion, the heartbeat, all that sort of stuff. It's not general intelligence. Hopefully this is general intelligence, but not always. General intelligence up here. And we couldn't have this general intelligence working if we didn't have all these narrows. So I suspect that's the end of what I'll say.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Now we've got some audience participation today, so we're asking you to pull out your phones, scan the QR code up here and vote on how important are the technologies of the metaverse, virtual land and Web 3.0 for humanity in the next 20 years, and how likely are we to achieve meaningful progress in the next 20 years. And I love this, we get to see the data come up in real time, so please pop it up there. So we've got a lot of, looks like 7.8 out of 10, I'm guessing, on likely to achieve meaningful process. Ah, look at that. The importance of diverse viewpoints in giving us a meaningful average. Can I ask you all to thank my panelists today? I hope you've enjoyed the session as much as I have. Thank you very much.